Thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. I sincerely appreciate it.
You should want to believe in an afterlife. You should want to believe in ultimate justice. You should want to believe in a creator. The alternative would be very nihilistic. The alternative would be, no, I hope that I'm correct more than what is good.
I'm not hoping that I'm correct more than what is good. What we're disagreeing on, Mr. Kirk, is what counts as good. You're assuming that your religion stands for what is good, but your religion has some pretty significant moral chasms built into it.
If you ever try to bullshit me like that again, I will rip off your arms.
Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and don't worry, the video is about to begin. I just wanted to take a moment to make you aware of my Patreon, the link for which can be found in the description below. Sign up today for as little as £3 per month and you can gain access to a plethora of perks and extras, including downloadable audio-only and ad-free versions of my podcast that you can listen to on the go. You can also have your question answered in a monthly video, and better still, depending on which tier you choose, you could even sit down for a Skype call with yours truly, Magic Skeptic. All that is available and much, much more. All you got to do is click the link in the description below. I hope to see you there. Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and you're all most welcome to another episode of the most annoying religious people. Up for today is one Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk is a right-wing political conservative commentator, I guess you could say. He gives talks and so on and so forth. But he's also, not surprisingly, a Christian. Aren't most of them Christian? I mean, let's face it, you could probably have guessed that he was Christian as soon as I said right-wing and conservative. But look, whatever. I mean, the demographics are irrelevant. What matters is the ideas. What matters is the reasoning and whether or not it has integrity, whether or not the reasoning contains fallacies, or whether or not it can stand up to scrutiny. So with all that in mind, I'm not going to delay here, but just going to dive right in here. What you're about to see is a clip of Charlie Kirk answering an atheist's question. And let's just say that Charlie Kirk's answer leaves a lot to be desired. But as per usual, dear listener, I'll allow you to be the judge. Let's dive right in.
Can you make a secular argument for natural rights?
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You exist. Everyone exists. And so what in the natural state, meaning absent of government, what does a person have? Well, you have consciousness, you have your physical activity, you have your thoughts, you have ideas, you potentially have property, right? And if you were just in the natural state, I mean, how you get to that natural state is based on your own theistic interpretation of being. But even a committed atheist will exist. There has been a natural state. You're a committed atheist? Okay, I'll pray for you.
So while there's no substance to address at this point yet, just a point of order here, you can already see how condescending Charlie Kirk is. Oh, you're an atheist? I'll pray for you. And he says so with a smugness and a sense of condescension, right? This really is irritating and probably gives you some sense of why I have featured Mr. Kirk in this episode of the most annoying religious people.
Are you atheist or are you agnostic?
Agnostic, I guess. I just like to take the position of I don't really know what's going on. I don't think really anyone knows what's going on.
So it's agnostic?
Yeah, I guess so, yeah. Sure.
Oh, okay, cool. I respect agnostic a lot more than atheist. Atheist is...
It's too cocky to say, there's absolutely no God.
Well, it's equally as cocky to say you don't know, which is what atheists are. But that's why you're an agnostic. That's why I ask for clarification. Because I love the people that say, Charlie, how do you know that there's a God? Well, I was like, are you an atheist? Yes. Well, how do you know there's not a God? Yeah, exactly. It's equally as cocky to say that.
So we're already in very deep waters here, and as you can tell, Charlie has a very particular view of atheists as these people who are rather certain that there is no God. He saddles atheists with this definition of knowledge and belief that requires 100% certainty. Now, to be fair, it is the questioner who says that it is a bit cocky for atheists to claim that they know that there is no God. But then Charlie Kirk chimes in and agrees, of course. But I think it's important to point out here, and this does come down to definitions, guys, and so if you're using words differently, fair enough, but let me just clarify my usage of these words. When I say that I'm an atheist, I'm not saying that I know with 100% certainty that there are no gods. All I'm pointing out is that I'm unconvinced that there is a God because those who claim to believe in one have failed to meet their burden of proof. We don't need 100% certainty in order to disbelieve something. That is a nonsense. Knowledge, and for something to get into that category, doesn't require 100% certainty. Certainty here is kind of like a red herring. And this is what he appears to be saddling atheists with, right? So he's saying that, oh, well, atheists are cocky because they claim to know that there is no God, and that's just a nonsense.
Are you an atheist? Yes. Well, how do you know there's not a God?
Yeah, exactly.
It's equally as cocky to say that.
That's only a nonsense if you're claiming 100% certainty, which appears to be the usage of the word knowledge that he's deploying here. But I've never met an atheist that uses the word knowledge or claims to know with 100% certainty in that way, right? When I say I don't believe in God, I'm saying that I've looked at the evidence and I find it unpersuasive. I find it unconvincing. Am I saying 100% that there is no God? Absolutely not. That would be a cocky statement. But it is okay to say that I don't believe in God. It's even okay to say that I believe that no gods exist. It doesn't require 100% certainty, though. Furthermore, there are a countless number of mythological creatures, gods, and entities that cannot be disproven with 100% certainty. And yet Charlie Kirk doesn't believe, I assume, in any of those ghosts, ghouls, goblins, and differing gods. Has Charlie Kirk ever proven with 100% certainty that there is no Zeus? Has he ever proven with 100% certainty that there is no Wotan? You name it. Whatever God concept you want to run with, Charlie Kirk hasn't proven that those things don't exist with 100% certainty, and yet he is not a subscriber to any of those supernatural beliefs. Has anyone ever disproven the existence of ghosts? Am I unreasonable for disbelieving in ghosts when nobody has definitively ruled out the existence of them? This is absolutely ridiculous epistemologically speaking. If you're going to say that it's inappropriate to be an atheist because God hasn't been ruled out 100%, in other words, if you're going to say that honest atheists should identify as agnostics simply because God hasn't been ruled out with certainty, well then I'm afraid to say you're going to pay a very serious epistemological price, Mr. Kirk. That means you are shackling yourself to agnosticism on a whole host of other mythological entities that have not been ruled out with 100% certainty. You're going to have to remain agnostic on ghosts. You're going to have to remain agnostic on Zeus. You're going to have to remain agnostic on Wotan, Thor, etc., etc., etc. But this is insanity. This is absolutely asinine. I don't have to rule something out 100% in order to disbelieve it. That's why I don't believe in ghosts. That's why I don't believe in demons. That's why I don't believe in fairies or pixies or Thor or your God, Mr. Kirk. The truth is, I am justified in my non-belief until such time that you, or the believer in any of these mythological propositions, meets their burden of proof. And if you're going to suggest otherwise, then you have a very bitter pill to swallow, because you're going to have to remain agnostic on all of the other God propositions that have been presented throughout history, as well as all of the other mythological and supernatural entities in the realm of the occult and what have you. Now, as far as I can tell, dear listener, that is a completely unreasonable stance. This is what led the likes of even Richard Dawkins to coin the phrase tooth fairy agnostic. In other words, Dawkins says that he is agnostic in relation to God in the same way that he is agnostic in relation to the tooth fairy, which is to say that nobody has ever disproven the tooth fairy. So if you really want to play this game, sure, I'm agnostic on the tooth fairy. I can't know that there is no tooth fairy, but I live out my life not believing in the tooth fairy because nobody has ever demonstrated or provided any persuasive evidence to suggest that the tooth fairy actually exists. Well, the same is true with God. So I'm going to go with Dawkins on this. If you're going to insist on playing this agnostic game, Mr. Kirk, well, then I'm a tooth fairy agnostic. I live my life as though there isn't a tooth fairy, just like I live my life as though your God doesn't exist. And if you want to say that I can't rule them out 100%, it's going to be very easy to get a yes for me on that, because I'm honest. But you haven't ruled them out either, and yet I don't imagine you'd want to say that you're agnostic in relation to other people's gods and other ridiculous mythological propositions. So pick your poison, Mr. Kirk. All I can tell you is that I don't believe in God because people like you haven't proven it. And I don't think that makes me dishonest. I don't think that makes me irrational. And I don't think I have to take on the label of agnostic. And if you're going to force me, you're going to have to take on that label as well in relation to all those other gods that you've, by definition, rejected precisely because you're a Christian. Let's move on.
I'll give you 3 things on atheism and Christianity. And so I'm a Christian. I could go on about that for quite some time. But number 1, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist.
Another ridiculous and condescending smear. Really, Mr. Kirk, you don't have enough faith to be an atheist? As though not believing in the magical, miracle-working sky god were the faith-based position here. As though the person who holds up their hands and says, hey, listen, I just can't see the evidence for it. Nobody has presented any persuasive or compelling evidence, so I guess I just don't believe in that thing, in that magical supernatural proposition. You're really going to stand there and tell us that that's the faith-based proposition. Meanwhile, people on your side of the camp, in an attempt to demonstrate the existence of your God, do nothing other than appeal to emotional reasoning, stack one fallacy on top of another, and make assertions. Are you kidding me?
I refuse to believe that all this natural order that we have, the connection of human beings, the serendipity that I encounter, I know all of you encounter, the Earth positioning to the sun, all of this is just by mistake.
And the Straw Man of the Year award goes to dun, 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 Charlie Kirk. When are theists going to stop telling this lie? You refuse to believe that this is all an accident? First of all, atheism is a single belief on a single issue. Is there a God? Atheists say, no, we're not convinced. Everything after that has nothing to do with atheism. So when you saddle atheists with various cosmological views and various views of physics and whether or not reality is an accident, you are saddling atheists with something that has absolutely nothing to do with atheists. You might as well have said that atheists are, meat eaters, or atheists are vegetarians. That might make it more clear, dear listener, right? When you saddle atheists with additional propositions, you're saddling them with something that has nothing to do with atheism, right? So that's the first thing. Secondly, Charlie Kirk insinuating that accidents being the explanation for all of this, for reality, him insinuating that that's ridiculous, doesn't mean that that's not true.
All of this is just by mistake.
Just because something is unlikely doesn't mean that it's impossible. Now, just to be clear, dear listener, I'm not saying that reality, life, and all the complexity that resides therein, I'm not saying that that is best explained by a cosmic accident. But pretending like that's a ridiculous point of view doesn't make it untrue. Insinuating that that's a silly position to hold doesn't mean that that is, in fact, a silly position. You'd have to demonstrate that. Has he demonstrated this? Does making fun of it make it untrue? Absolutely not. It could be the case that we are the consequence of a cosmic accident. That is, in fact, a possibility. That possibility hasn't been formally removed from the candidate explanations, and pretending like it's ridiculous doesn't make it such. The other problem here is that Mr. Kirk has presented us with a false dichotomy, otherwise known as a false choice. This is when a presenter tells us that there are 2 options and that these options are exhaustive, when in fact there are more options, maybe a 3rd, a 4th, a 5th, or what have you. What Kirk wants us to believe is that there are 2 choices. Either God created everything, or reality is best explained by a cosmic accident. And of course, because the accident hypothesis doesn't sound persuasive to many people,
all of this is just by mistake.
Therefore, we're left with the one and only true choice, and that is a creator or a God. But the truth is, guys, there are other options. There are other competing hypotheses. There are other candidate explanations. It could be the case that there are physical laws that are, as of yet, undiscovered that make it such that universes are always created in this way, that universes always emerge in the manner that we find ourselves in, right? It could be the case that the physical constants couldn't have been otherwise. In other words, the probability that the universe was going to produce life and that it was going to take this form was in fact 100%. It couldn't have been otherwise. Again, for Charlie Kirk's dichotomy to stand, he would have to formally remove that candidate explanation from the list of candidates. And he hasn't done that. He hasn't even acknowledged that this option exists. In his worldview, there are two options, cosmic accident or God. But this third option, and I need only present you with one to demonstrate the falsehood of his dichotomy, this third option hasn't been formally removed. And this is a very real option that physicists are considering.
I mean, we just know so little about what constitutes life and how it... I mean, we have the universe we have, and you could imagine fiddling with the numbers and making them... To what extent that freedom is even there, mathematically, isn't clear.
We don't know the answer. We don't know enough about the universe to know if there's a fundamental theory that says it has to be this way, or if these weird coincidences are there because we happen to be measuring them.
It could be the case that when universes form and when they develop over time, that they always take shape in the way that our universe has. But here's the elephant in the room. The truth is, we don't know why the universe has taken the form it currently has.
Sadly, we just don't know.
I mean, we just know so little about what constitutes life.
We don't know enough. It's part of the problem.
We don't know how the universe formed exactly. We know how planets form, we know how galaxies form, we know that the Big Bang got it all started. What I'm talking about is the physical parameters, such as the cosmological constant or the strong and weak nuclear forces and so on. We don't know whether or not those parameters could be different. Maybe they could, maybe they couldn't. But the truth is that the jury is still out on these questions. Like I said, it could be the case that when universes form, they always form with these precise physical properties. Charlie Kirk hasn't even acknowledged this as an option. This is a false dichotomy, guys. And if you accept this false dichotomy, you're buying into an utterly fallacious and ridiculous argument. And then Charlie Kirk gets to play his intuitional game where he points out that a cosmic accident is much less persuasive than a designer who made things as they are. But the dichotomy is false, the reasoning is fallacious, and as a consequence, I must dismiss it. And I would recommend that you do so as well, dear listener. But let's move on.
I'm supposed to believe this is just fooled by randomness. That takes a lot more faith than to believe that there was a natural creator that put all this together. I have a lot more faith that all this beauty that majesty that we have is behind that.
Oh my God, such wisdom. And again, you hear the false dichotomy reiterated and reiterated and reiterated. Either a designer or this was all a cosmic accident. You mean I'm meant to believe that this is all just an accident? That takes way more faith than to believe that there's a magical miracle working sky god. Oh my God. Even if the dichotomy were true, you know what? Let's go with it. Let's just give him what he wants. Let's pretend for the sake of conversation that this is a true dichotomy, that there are two options, magical sky god creator, or this is a cosmic accident. Even then, his argument doesn't work because you haven't formally removed the accident hypothesis from the candidate explanations. Again, assuming there are two, what's more likely? Magical, supernatural, hitherto unobserved magical sky god, or accident? David Hume's reasoning on this, I think, is quite spot on. Hume pointed out that we should always reject the greater miracle. The greater miracle, this idea that there's a supernatural, unobserved, powerful, magical force that there's no evidence for. The idea that that's the best explanation when compared with an accident, really and truly, I don't even buy that. If your mind is so poisoned by religion, and if your critical thinking faculties and your skepticism is so corrupted that out of two options, accident or magical invisible sky god, you find the sky god more persuasive? I don't know what to tell you. Perhaps you're too far gone and this channel isn't for you. But even on the assumption that his dichotomy is true, I'm not persuaded. But perhaps, dear listener, and to extend an olive branch here, perhaps that says more about my biases than anything else, and I'm willing to accept that. It's not like this particular argument is the hill that I'm going to die on. I just thought it might be interesting for the sake of discussion to acknowledge the dichotomy is true, just to see where it would lead us. I'll leave myself in your capable hands, and you can judge me on this particular talking point. But without further ado, let's continue with Mr. Kirk's presentation and see what other grandiose fallacies await us.
Without God, there would be no atheists, so it's kind of a fun.
And without irrationality and an inability to reason, there wouldn't be any theists. Checkmate, Mr. Kirk. Checkmate.
If I can ask you a question, if that's okay. As an agnostic, is that fair? Agnostic / atheist?
Sure.
Do you hope you're wrong? Do you hope there's a creator?
Man, dude, you want to like have dinner or something? No, I'm just kidding. No, that's a good question. I mean, I don't know, man. I don't know.
Okay, so the answer should be, hopefully, is yes, because you should want to believe in an afterlife. You should want to believe in ultimate justice. You should want to believe in a creator. The alternative would be very nihilistic.
I don't care, Mr. Kirk, what you think I should want to believe. We've really reached the bottom of the barrel here when he starts lecturing atheists in the audience about what they should and shouldn't want to believe. And also, this is ridiculous from the word go, because what I want to believe is irrelevant. Even if I wanted to believe in a heaven, Mr. Kirk, beliefs don't work that way. If I want to see my family again, it doesn't mean that I can compel myself to believe it. Sure, it would be lovely to see my loved ones again in an afterlife, but wanting that doesn't make it so. Wanting it doesn't make me believe it. So your soliloquy here about what we should and shouldn't want is irrelevant. It's absolutely ridiculous. But you know what? It's not obvious to me that anybody should want this. As Christopher Hitchens once put it, this is a prize not worth having. Think about it. In the sky, or in heaven, wherever you want to say, there resides this unalterable, unelected, divine dictator who calls all of the shots and makes all of the rules. If we disagree with the rule, tough shit. We can't alter this dictator. We can't remove him. We haven't elected him. This is the essence, as Christopher Hitchens put it, this is the essence of dictatorship. Do people really want to believe that there's an all-seeing eye in the sky that lies in wait in order to judge us? And that this dictator and his diktats are going to be the ultimate arbiter as to whether or not I see my family again or go to a place of hellfire and torture, depending on your interpretation and whether or not you believe in a literal hell. But at the very least, I'm going to be annihilated for failing to follow these prescriptions. This doesn't seem to be something that anybody should want. This is really quite terrifying when one reflects on it. To say nothing of how terrible the rules are in the here and now, and how Mr. Kirk's religion immiserates women and homosexuals and people all around the world. Look at the people of Africa, where the Catholic Church enforces the idea that contraception usage is immoral, where in parts of Africa there's a serious AIDS problem and a poverty problem, which is made worse by having more children, and the AIDS problem is made worse by having unprotected sex. The idea that these religions and their tenets are something worth wanting really doesn't map onto my intuitions at all, dear listener. This really doesn't map on at all. There's a lot in this that is a Cirque du Soleil level of brutality, a Cirque du Soleil level of immorality. So with the greatest of respect, Mr. Kirk, no, I don't know if I want your religion. And I say I don't know. Maybe I should just say, no, I don't want it. I'm also not necessarily convinced that heaven is an intrinsically good idea, because if I go to heaven and my loved ones don't, and yet I'm still happy, am I really myself? Or are you going to tell us that everybody ultimately goes to heaven? And if you say that, how is that a moral system? If Adolf Hitler is in heaven, are you kidding me? How is that ultimate justice? There's so many problems here, and even if heaven is perfect, and it somehow, despite those problems I've raised, is wonderful despite the problems, even then, the idea of an eternal afterlife belittles this life. It turns this life into a waiting room. It makes this life irrelevant. And I don't know if that's a good thing. I'm not so sure. I'm not convinced, Mr. Kirk. And telling me that I should want all these things isn't very persuasive, I'm afraid. You're just going to have to do better. You're just going to have to do better. And I'm just going to have to move on.
You should want to believe in an afterlife. You should want to believe in ultimate justice. You should want to believe in a creator. The alternative would be very nihilistic. The alternative would be, no, I hope that I'm correct more than what is good.
I'm not hoping that I'm correct more than what is good. What we're disagreeing on, Mr. Kirk, is what counts as good. You're assuming that your religion stands for what is good. But your religion has some pretty significant moral chasms built into it. I've already addressed several of them. I'm not convinced your religion is good. Even if there is a God, I'm not convinced that would be a good thing. Again, an all-seeing eye in the sky. But even on the specifics of Christianity, Christianity is a cult of human sacrifice. Jesus is tortured and killed for our sins, and people like you celebrate that as though it were a moral action, when in fact, God could have just forgiven the sins. Christianity is not a religion that teaches us about the value of love. It's a religion that teaches us about the value of human sacrifice and blood magic. Blood was required to pay the sin debt, if you will. That is a catastrophically immoral idea. And if you think it's a good one, then your humanity has been sacrificed at the altar of your religion. I made a video recently where a particular theist said that Christianity is a religion that teaches us that death is defeated by love. But that's not the case. Christianity doesn't teach us that death is defeated by love. It teaches us that death is defeated by obedience. Obedience to a completely immoral and abhorrent scripture. Obedience to an absolutely immoral God who expects human sacrifice, or at the very least allows human sacrifice as a retributive act in the name of other people's sins, who are then absconding justice and not facing their own responsibility, the despicable and wicked notion of vicarious redemption, that somebody else can take your place on the cross. This is not moral teaching. Moral teaching includes the idea that people are held responsible for their actions. Your religion doesn't teach that. And if you're going to respond and say, oh, but those who do bad end up in hell ultimately, no, not if they genuinely repent. You said that your God is all forgiving and all merciful. If that is true, and Adolf Hitler genuinely, an emphasis on the word genuine, if he genuinely repented for the Holocaust, then Adolf Hitler is in heaven. I don't have enough faith to believe that, Mr. Kirk. You know what? Maybe I'm morally imperfect, but in my worldview, somebody like Adolf Hitler doesn't deserve forgiveness ever. That's something you can't say in your religion, Mr. Kirk, and you want me to buy into the idea that you've got good on your side? I'm sorry. Don't make me sick.
See, you should want to believe in a good God. You should want to believe in a forgiving God. You should want to believe in an ultimate creator. So
it seems that fucking anything gets a round of applause from that audience. They're like a fucking crowd of seals. People are definitely going to clip that. Oh well.
if you hope you're wrong, which any reasonable atheist or agnostic should, because you'd want to see your loved ones after, you'd want to hope that people that do horrible things, that don't come to their own salvation, are held accountable in one way or the other. That would hopefully be something that a human being would desire to see. Maybe not. Maybe there's an alternative that you would want to believe in.
Yes, ultimate justice and seeing my loved ones again would be lovely, Mr. Kirk. I don't deny that. But at what price? I won't recapitulate the entire argument here, but I did make a video in the past titled, "Is Heaven Good?" And it is a really important question. And I've already kind of echoed the sentiment of that video thus far in this conversation, but let me just spell it out in a little bit more detail. If indeed there is a heaven, but also a hell, whether that's a literal hell or annihilation or what have you, fine. But if there is a heaven and my mother goes there because she's a good person, and I don't go there because God decides I'm a bad person, how could my mother be happy in heaven? And if she is she just suffering from a delusion? Has God kept the knowledge of me burning in hell a secret from her? And if so, how is this moral? So if she is happy in heaven despite the fact that I'm in hell, it can't possibly be my mother. It's either that my mother has been hoodwinked, maybe there's a duplicate version of me in heaven that keeps her happy, but the real version of me is burning in hell. That would be deception, by the way, which would be immoral. Or maybe she's just blissfully unaware and happy anyway because heaven, makes your brain such that you can't contemplate sad things, which is to say that my mother wouldn't be my mother anymore. Because if it really was my mother, she'd be traumatized and upset that I'm in hell, and she would be doing everything within her power to save me from that state of suffering. There are real problems here, Mr. Kirk. And again, one of the ways out of this is to suggest that maybe just everybody goes to heaven, and that would be immoral and there would be no ultimate justice. Where is the ultimate justice here, Mr. Kirk? I would love to hear you expound on these details, but when you just assume that your worldview is the pinnacle of justice, when you assume that your worldview is the pinnacle of good, and that people should just automatically want what your worldview says that it offers, when in fact it really doesn't, all of this just reveals your position to be fallacious and uncompelling. It also reveals you to be a thinker who lacks depth. Now look, let's extend an olive branch here. Maybe because this is a quick answer to a question, maybe because you're on stage and your time is limited, you're not able to expand on these issues, but I'm not convinced that there are good answers to these challenges. And look, dear listener, if you're aware of Mr. Kirk expounding on these issues in another video and you want to correct the record because I got something wrong, jump into the comments below and make me aware of such a video and I'll gladly watch it, and I will make an update to this video where I will correct the record. But to be honest, I'm not going to hold my breath. I don't imagine that's going to happen. I think the writing is on the wall with this one. Let's continue.
If you actually extrapolate the atheist worldview to its furthest extent, that as soon as you die, it's just darkness, that this is all just randomness, that there's not an omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent creator that wove this entire world together, that there's no such thing as ultimate forgiveness or a gift from the Almighty. It's a really, I just think, a very dark worldview, and one that, if you put it toward its absolute end extension, is not one that I personally would want to live under. So. However, to answer your question, my political views are perfectly compatible with people of any religious belief, including atheism, which is a religious belief. So that's a whole different lecture. So thank you. I appreciate it.
And here, once again, Kirk is saddling atheists with a point of view that they don't necessarily hold. And in so doing, he reveals another false dichotomy that's at play in his thinking. From his perspective, somebody either believes in God or they don't. And if they don't, they must believe that death is the end and that all there is darkness. But please notice, dear listener, that somebody could be an atheist and believe in reincarnation. Because atheism is just about whether or not somebody believes in a God. You could be an atheist and there is no contradiction at all in believing in reincarnation. So one could not believe in God, and yet when we die, they don't believe that there's darkness. They believe that reincarnation is true, and that we come back as other humans or other animals or what have you. So yet again, another false dichotomy at play in his thinking. And I don't care if you think that my worldview is dark or not, Mr. Kirk. That is utterly irrelevant to me. This is something that happens all the time with theists. They act as though the universe owes them a sense of hope. If indeed I'm right and there is no God, and if indeed I'm right and the end really is the end, because Kirk does happen to be correct in my case, that I do believe that death is the end, and not that there will be darkness, because darkness is a perception, there would just be nothingness. The analogy I frequently use is, I ask people, what were you worrying about in the medieval period? And they'll say, what? Well, I didn't exist. And then I'll ask them, well, did that suck? Did that, was that unpleasant? And they'll say, well, no, because I didn't exist. And precisely. And so I imagine that that's kind of what death is going to be like. It'll be like the medieval period when I didn't exist. And that doesn't scare me at all. So he is right in my case. It's still a false dichotomy. Just because you don't believe in God doesn't mean that you share my view of what death is. But with that acknowledged, if I'm correct and death really is the end, and that makes you upset, Tough shit, Mr. Kirk. Tough. The universe does not owe you a sense of hope, and if you find reality dark, depressing, and traumatizing, well, that's on you. There's so many traumatizing and dark elements of reality. I think the problem of evil is a very serious one. The number of people who get cancer is a very dark and unpleasant fact. It doesn't make it any less true. Just because something is dark and unpleasant doesn't mean that it's false. And yet theists like Kirk here walk around like atheism being dark is a mark against it, epistemologically speaking.
It's a really, I just think, a very dark worldview, and one that, if you put it toward its absolute end extension, is not one that I personally would want to live under. So.
As though the fact that it might be a dark worldview, and that is a matter of opinion, by the way, but as though the fact that it might be a dark worldview somehow counts against it in terms of whether or not it's true. This is completely and utterly fallacious reasoning. And so, all I'll say in closing here is that I'm not convinced it is a dark worldview. I think there's a lot of beauty to be found in a secular worldview. I think there's a lot of beauty and profundity to be found in viewing the universe as either a cosmic accident or as an emergent property of the multiverse or even just as a mystery. Because again, my honest answer about all of this and why we're here and why the universe exists and why there's something rather than nothing, I don't know the answer to any of those questions. All I know is that the majesty of reality is enough for me. I find reality enchanting on its own terms, both the good and the bad. The fact that this universe is eventually going to end in a heat death, or the fact that our sun is eventually going to extinguish and all life in this solar system will be terminated, that makes life right now all the more precious and all the more profound. Think about that for a moment. Let's imagine that there's no life anywhere else in the cosmos. Let's imagine the only life that's ever existed or will ever exist exists here and now on planet Earth. Now let's imagine the moment where all that comes to an end. Isn't it profound, dear listener, to think about the fact that we are the lucky few who experienced consciousness for a blink of an eye in the sum total history of an infinite or incredibly long existing cosmos? How profound is that? How unbelievably mesmerizing is that, if indeed that is the case? If we're the lucky few who were able to take a deep breath and become self-aware, if we are the only atoms in the history and the future of the cosmos to ever be self-aware and experience consciousness, and that was only for a blip in the grand scheme of things, and then it's extinguished and never happens again, how precious, how profound, how special are these few moments that we have? I mean, Jesus Christ, guys, I'm getting a lump in my throat talking about this. The idea that atheism is dark, hopeless, or depressing just doesn't work for me. I just don't get it. I've said it before and I'll say it again. The majesty of reality is enough for me. And no, Charlie Kirk, I don't need your burning bush. I don't need your blood sacrifice. I don't need your cult of human sacrifice. I don't need somebody dying for my sins. I don't need the magic sky god. I don't need any of that to feel these feelings of profundity that I'm describing right now. And I hope, dear listener, that I've given you some sense of why atheism can in fact be profound and majestic despite the protestations of this imbecile Charlie Kirk. And no, lastly, atheism is not a religion. You can look up the definition of religion in the dictionary, and look, maybe you're using a different definition for religion, Mr. Kirk, but under any typical common parlance usage of the word religion, atheism does not count. But it's quite funny that you would call atheism a religion. It's almost like you acknowledge that being called a religion is a mark against your worldview. So, you know, you have to saddle atheists with that same label. Oh, well, if religions are stupid, well, you have a religion as well, right? So there's something about that that's quite laughable, but you know what? Maybe he's using the word differently. He didn't get a chance to clarify. He's on a clock, whatever. I'm trying to extend as many olive branches here as I can. But suffice to say, dear listener, I don't find Charlie Kirk's comments on atheism very persuasive. And I hope I've gone some way towards convincing you of the same. With that said, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like on it. That helps out the channel enormously. And if it is your first time visiting the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button. And while you're at it, make sure you check the bell notification icon. That's actually surprisingly important, guys. When you check that bell, it makes sure that you're kept up to date with all things on the channel. And you'll even receive notifications as and when my latest videos go live. Other than that, thank you very much to my patrons. You guys are amazing. Your generosity blows me away. I feel like a broken record thanking you in every video, but I really am humbled by your generosity, and just from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much. If you want to become a patron like those mentioned, jump into the description box below, hit the Patreon link, and you'll be brought to my Patreon page where you can sign up for as little as £3 per month, and you will gain access to a plethora of perks, bonuses, and extras. So with all that said, thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. All the best. Bye-bye.